But there's a transformation that occurs in most of us when we go from being that child that you saw there to the adult that we become. We somehow along the line pick up a tradition of worry. And this worry turns out to be something that's a fairly serious challenge for us. It's not something we should ignore. It interferes with our individual effectiveness while we're living. It shortens our lives. Doctors, medical experts tell us that the stress in our lives causes us to, enough chemical changes go on in us during those years of stress that we lose a couple of years at the end of our lives on average from that. And not only that, we have wasted all of those years in between, which have been joyful, with whatever hours we spend worrying and fretting about things, largely that don't happen. And so today we're going to talk about one of the most important transformations that we can imagine. A transformation going back to that state we had when we were children, and we sort of understood that God loved us and He just took joy in providing for us and taking care of all of our needs, to the worried, anxious people that most of the world's 7 billion people are today. Dan's talked a lot over the last couple of weeks about our ambition as a church to be transformed, our prayers that we would be transformed, not from what we are now into a, quote, great church, but that we would transform the community in which we find ourselves, Old Town Alexandria, the state of Virginia, the D.C. area, the country, and the world. So that's what we ought to be in the business. And that begins with a transformation in ourselves from people of worry to people of rest. This text is not the text that Audra read, but it's the text in the couple of verses that precede that. You've got the NIV version in your bulletin, and on the slide here we have the RSV version, which reads a little differently. Basically says, unless the Lord builds a house, those who labor build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord stands watch over a city, those who try to guard it stand watch in vain. And then the line that really impresses me is this line that says, in vain do you rise up early and go to bed late, eating the bread of anxious toil. It's not just that we work anxiously. Okay, that's the point. For God gives sleep to those He loves. Eugene Peterson, who wrote the version that you find in the Message, says it this way on the next slide. He's using a lot more colloquial language. He talks in terms of, if God doesn't build a house, you're really just building a shack. And why bother trying to stand watch over the city? You might as well take a nap. And finally he says, it's useless to rise up early and go to bed late and working your worried fingers to the bone. He says, don't you and I know that God really delights in providing for us? So this is our main text. Just 2 verses out of maybe 30,000 in the Bible. And so you might ask, well, why pick on these 2 verses? What about the context, Bill? What does this look like in terms of the larger picture? So the next slide sort of starts to walk us through that. You see there on the right-hand side an artist's representation. If you Google the expression Temple of Solomon or Palace of Solomon, this is one of a jillion pictures that come up. And who knows how accurate it is, but one thing that it does convey is a sense of permanence and magnificence and size and security. And so it looks pretty formidable there on the top of the hillside there. People used to sing this hymn, this psalm. These psalms were also songs, and there are 15 of them that are known as the Songs of the Ascents. out of the 150 psalms, this 10% of them, and people would chant them or sing them or recite them on the pilgrimages they would take from the towns and villages and the farms where they lived outside the city into the city 2 or 3 times a year. It's kind of like what goes on at a Redskins game, if you've ever been to one, and you're walking from the metro to the stadium and the crowd breaks out and hails to the Redskins, and you're all kind of singing that, although none of you knows each other. It's just what you do. And these words had an educational value. The families are doing this together, and the parents are teaching the kids things, and they're saying, our king, King Solomon, said, you know, clearly I'm a powerful guy because I was able to build this temple and this fortified city and to stand watch over it, but it was truly God himself that was providing that security. It was not just me. Not only do I look powerful, but God is on my team. So that's kind of Solomon's message, and the people walking up could say to themselves, you know, that applies to the king, but maybe it applies to me too. Maybe I don't have to be anxious. Maybe I can just do my work and rest content in the idea that God will be providing and provides an increase while I do that. But there's a larger context that I want to focus on today, the broader biblical sweep. I want to look at worry as it figures in the conversation between us and God throughout this extended period that's recorded here for thousands of years. And the topic first surfaces in the book of Genesis, and it's significant the way it surfaces. You remember that everything is fine with Adam and Eve and God. They see each other face to face. It's a fellowship. There's nothing but love in that fellowship and purity and holiness. And one day, Adam and Eve step outside that fellowship. They eat of the one tree they're not supposed to eat of. And all of a sudden, the next day, things are different. And Adam says this, you know, God comes into the garden, where are you all? And they say, Adam says, you know, I heard you in the garden, and I was worried because I knew that I'd stepped outside the bounds that you had for me, and I wasn't sure how I was going to handle this moment. The topic comes up again, and we see in the next slide, which is the people leaving Egypt. And Moses says to the people are worried. There are hundreds of thousands of them, and they're trapped between a wall of water that's in front of them and the Egyptian army led by Pharaoh that's approaching on chariots behind. They're worried, they're fretful, they're anxious. And Moses says, fear not, just stand still. You know, not asking you to do anything, stand still and see the salvation which God will show you today. So they see the greatest salvation that people have probably ever seen up to that point. But it's not long after that they find another occasion to worry. And that's in the next slide, which talks about manna. And I just want to review that story just a little bit. So the people leave Egypt. They say pretty quickly, hey, the food doesn't seem to be as good out here in the desert as it had been back in Egypt. We had meat, we had onions, we had leeks, all those things. It was great. And now we're out here starving to death. What are we going to eat? And God says, I'm going to provide a special food for you. It's going to be a food that not only takes care of your every dietary need, but tells you in a special way that you do not have to worry. Doesn't matter how much of it you try to collect in the morning, you'll always have enough for that day. You don't need to try to collect for 2 days because there'll be more manna tomorrow. In fact, if you do try to collect for 2 days, all the excess you get will rot away in the waste. And he says, except on the 6th day, because I want you to rest on the 7th day, and then you gather twice as much, and it won't rot. And so every week there'll be this daily rhythm of understanding that there's no need to worry. And of course, people put the lie to that. They go out and show, you may think there's no reason to worry, but we'll show you. We'll worry anyway. We'll try to collect too much. We'll watch it turn to a rotten stench in our homes during the week. And then we'll go out on the 7th day when we don't need to. And, oh yeah, all that stuff that we collected yesterday, that's still good for today. So they found a way to work. We fast forward to the prophet Isaiah. And so Isaiah comes up. This has to be the greatest marketing message for the Christian faith ever. It says basically, God says, in repentance and rest is your salvation. All you have to do to live in my presence and the joy of my presence and my provision is to recognize the dysfunction in the world for what it is, recognize all the reasons to be dissatisfied with life, all the quarreling and the arguing and the selfishness and all the rest of that. Just turn your back on that and just relax, and you'll find salvation. And he says, in quietness and trust is your strength. I don't know how I can give you a better deal. And then God says through Isaiah these next words, which are on the next slide. He said, but you weren't buying. You would have none of it. And it just amazes me that we would sit there with an offer like that. And we all know this. This is not something where we say how stupid those people in the past could be. We know that we're living that kind of life now. You know, that here's this offer, and we find reasons instead to be uptight and worry about it. Jesus himself addresses this issue many times. Here's one example from Matthew 6. He says, do not worry. And he says something, so even then, remember we said the medical evidence was that worry shortens our lives. He says, he attacks that. He says, how many of you by worrying add even an hour to your lifetime? And you get the picture that the people of that time knew, even without the science that we have today, worry was not an asset. Worry was not a positive in their lives. And then the Apostle Paul addresses the same problem. He says, don't be anxious about anything. He says, don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, you make your prayers known to God with thanksgiving, and the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will keep your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Okay, next one. This is an aside. It was more for the earlier audience. There were a lot of teenagers in that audience. They're all with their group now. But, you know, in our building, in our church, in thousands and thousands of churches all across America and all across the world, we all understand that the Bible is the inspired Word of God. And that is just a very cool thing. So all this focus on the book of the Bible when we're talking about worry is appropriate. But I want us to remember that something else is going on at the same time. If I could have the next slide, please. And that is that for these people, the Bible, not so much, it wasn't a single book back then, it was a bunch of scrolls and so on, but to them, it was the equivalent of Wikipedia today. And you remember the early days of Wikipedia, there was this question of whether it was as good as the Britannica, the Encyclopedia Britannica, which was supposed to be the best source of knowledge as recently as 20, 25 years ago. And people very quickly started to notice that the error rate in Wikipedia, because of the crowdsourcing, because there were multiple authors and they kept checking each other's work, were fewer than the errors in the Encyclopedia Britannica. And you have to remember that this book to them, it was this book of legal records, and it was a book of census, it was a book of genealogy, it was a book of who owned what land and who sold what land to whom. It was a book of the geopolitics of the region, the history of the region. It was a book about law. It was a book about self-help. There was all this stuff in how to succeed in business. You know, as our friends from Together We Bake talked about, you know, get to work on time, you know, have a good attitude, have a smile. All of that is captured in the book of Proverbs. And then it goes on and it talks about a few other things too. A few other things like that parting of the Red Sea, like the manna that were there every day for people to eat. And it sort of says, in our history, in our transactions, in all of life's business, there were a few things we did not understand. And we thought those were the most important things that happened to us. And so those we've also got in the book. These great gifts from God, including His Son, Jesus Christ. So if I could go on to the next slide, that provides kind of a review of where we are so far. namely anxiety and worry, are worthless, and we're far too complacent about just allowing worry to persist in our lives. We're complacent in the face that is shortening our lives and making those lives less worthwhile. I've talked about this on an individual basis, but the fact is that worry compromises our ability to work with each other, to love each other as couples, and to work effectively as couples raising kids, to work effectively in the workplace, to do common tasks, to reach across national boundaries and work. Worry is always at the root of all of these problems and all of this dysfunction in the world as we have it. And one of the results of that is that worry compromises our effective witness. So out of the world's 7 billion people, most of those people can say, well, I do my best with worry, and that's sort of the end of the story. But there are 2 billion of us who claim to be children of God, who claim to understand that God has plans for us that, like Jeremiah 29:11 that Dan mentioned earlier, that are only to bless us and not harm us, plans to give us hope in the future. And we've got an audience of that other 4 billion people. And, they say, don't talk to me about salvation. That's just something that I find impossible to believe in. Particularly when I see that you're going through life every bit as worried as I am. But you show me that you're calm in our workplace or at home when things are falling apart, and that you're not worried. You're dealing with the situation. You're not delusional. I mean, you have peace of mind not because you're ignorant. You have peace of mind because you're in full awareness of the situation. If you have that kind of peace of mind, I will follow you anywhere. It's not unlike the discussion that Jesus had with the Pharisees when he told a lame man that his sins were forgiven, and they kind of looked at him, and then he said, which is easier, to heal him so he can walk or forgive his sins? And he says, go pick up your pallet and walk. If Christians can say to the world around us, we're at peace, the world will sooner or later come around and say, oh, and what about that salvation story again? Why don't you tell me that part? I was interested in what you were doing because you were a person of peace in this kind of environment. But now I'm really on board. Okay, everybody's looking solemn right now. And that's a sign that I've convinced you that this is a tough nut to crack. So hopefully you're all thinking, gee, Bill better have some solutions here. The Bible better have some solutions that I can believe in and things that I can carry out and do. And that's what the next slide shows. Next slide shows that we need to be transformed. Dan's trying to get us to use that word every chance we get. I want to make sure we keep thinking transformation here, and not just transformation of ourselves, but as a means to transform others. Okay, next slide. So here's the way to do this. And before we get started, I just want to say that too faintly for most of you to see there, I can see it because I put it in there, that if you work with PowerPoint, you can put in a photograph, and it can sometimes overwhelm the print. Or you can hit the transparency a little bit, make it transparent. I've made this floating board that's floating in the Dead Sea there, almost impossible to see. But I want you to keep in mind this metaphor while we're going through this. How many of you learned how to swim when you were so young that you can barely remember what it was like? You were maybe 5 or 6 years old, something like that. Okay, how many of you learned when I did, when I was 16? Oh, 1 or 2 hands going up out of that crowd. All right, well, I want to paint this picture for you because I knew I was going to a college that had a swimming test. I was going to have to pass this. And so I was 16, and they took me to the pool, and they threw me in the deep end, and they said, relax. Well, I knew that was the one thing I must not do. I was my current height. I weighed 140 pounds. The neighbors would say, we knew the Hooks had a skeleton in their closet, but we didn't realize they were educating it. So I thrash around wildly. I look like Ichabod Crane out there, just sort of, I'd sink like a stone. And it didn't happen during just one session. This was several sessions when this was happening. And finally, one day, despite my best efforts, I relaxed. And a whole new world opened unto me at that point. Relaxing is about the only thing that you can do in the water. So now with that in mind, if you can hold that thought, we're going to go back and look at these ideas about how to deal with worry. One of them, which is kind of popular in the 21st century, is to say, oh, well, there must be an app that deals with worry, or maybe there's a program I can sign up for at the gym, or there's an extra activity on Tuesday nights, or I'll squeeze this into my daily routine in such and such a way, 20 minutes here or there, add something. In the 21st century, that's not very realistic or sustainable. We're all already maxed out. And I want to say, just like being in that pool, it requires less effort rather than more. And we can start by giving up some of those things that we're not particularly proud of ourselves. Usually one of the reasons we're worried is we're thinking about what other people think of us and what God thinks of us. And we're knowing that instead of tackling the jobs we need to tackle, we're wasting time, or we're doing something even worse with our time. We can give up those things. We can give up those things and relax. So instead of more effort, instead of tacking on something, think about what we could give up in our lives. Think about the stuff we can give up. When we get in the pool, we're traveling light. We don't bring the Mercedes into the pool. We don't bring the 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom house into the pool. We don't bring in the camper, the motorboat, the laptop, the smartphone. I took a smartphone into the pool once, and turns out that's not good. So, but we travel light. We give up. We have a lot less stuff. Next part is remembrance. And now I'm asking you to remember what came earlier in this little discussion. So the people of Israel frustrated God because they could never remember the gratitude from before. You know, the fact that they had gotten through this or that event. Oh, God got them out of Egypt. Oh, God got them across the sea. God took care of the stronger peoples that were already living in their land, and so on. So the message was always a constant encouragement to remember, hey, in the business of life, I've gotten through this when I was a kid, I got through this when I was a teenager, that when I was a young adult, and so on. We're all sitting here, none of us is starved to death so far, none of us, all of us still have enough health to get in the building, and we should remember and be grateful for God's past grace. And finally, going back to that pool analogy, very often when you're in the pool, particularly when you're 5 years old instead of 15, somebody is with you, mom or dad, and they're holding you. Remember how you'd lie down in the water and they'd hold you in the water. And mom or dad may have had their rough moments in dealing with you. They may have been angry with you and not wanted you to have certain behavior around the house. But my impression, sort of being at poolside and watching parents do this today, is that parents are very often at their best, at their most loving, when they're trying to teach that child how to float. And the person of Jesus is performing that same role for us in our lives. We're being held up. And we're not doing this through our own efforts, but we have access to, and we should take advantage of that access to Jesus as the provider of peace in that circumstance. Okay, so I made the earlier morning group a Bill Hook guarantee, which is that if you try one of these approaches or several of them, it will improve things. And if it doesn't, please come by and see me, and we'll talk about the physics of it all, because that's my expertise. But I guarantee you, I'll talk with you about it. And my guess is that we'll all, if we follow these ideas, and I'm giving a pep talk to myself at the same time, we'll find that we'll have, first of all, we'll be motivated to deal with worry and not be complacent about it, to deal with it by being aware that when we relax, so much of it will disappear, but we let go of things that we shouldn't be holding on to, that we're grasping so tightly. When we remember how God has been faithful in the past, we'll find ourselves worrying a lot less. Now, at this point, I have, you know, in church here, we always have a sort of all or nothing altar call, and I want to try out something a little more nuanced. So the next slide, no, okay, I'll make this last point. Rest is not the destination. Okay, being relaxed is not an end to itself. It's the starting point for doing what God has called us to do. And that calling, transforming Alexandria, transforming the D.C. area, the people who run the world from this city, transforming the city, that business starts from our rest. You might recall that one time, people are fond of saying, for example, that Adam's first day on earth was a day of rest. He was created on the sixth day. On the seventh day, God rested. Didn't have to go to work until a day later. We work from our rest instead of resting from our work. Okay, now the next slide. So I think there are several levels at which people could have been paying attention over the last 20 minutes or so. One of them is, I was barely audible. Okay, and that is either what I was trying to say you weren't buying, or it didn't feel that comfortable to you. You kind of thought, hey, worry doesn't sound so bad after this. You know, I think I'll keep on worrying. So I'll just stay put. You know, I'll hang on to all the worry that I've gathered around myself over the past many years. You might say, oh, there might have been a few things worth pondering, or if you were in some advanced state of this, you might say, you know, worry's not a serious challenge for me. I'm just a little bit of effort short of where I need to be. And I just want to say that that's one of the biggest lies that you and I will ever hear. That, oh, if I just put a little more self-effort into this, I'll be where I need to be. Okay? There's a second level. The second level is sort of seeking. I know I should relax more. I know I should worry less. I've had enough experience over my 20 years, or my 30 years, or my 60 or 70 years to be just a little skeptical of my ability to do this on my own. And I'm open to this idea that maybe this Jesus person could be of some help. And maybe this community, it doesn't look particularly worried now, maybe this community could be of some help to me in that journey. And then there's a third level of hearing a message, and that is somebody who's already all in. You're a Christian, you're already find yourself led to be transforming in your circle of influence, wherever that might be, and you're just looking to live out this calling in some kind of community, and you're thinking this might not be a bad one. So with that in mind, we're going to have an altar call. We're going to sing a hymn. It's number 338, How Firm a Foundation. And, you know, if you do come forward, there'll be a professional pastor at the front to greet you, a card-carrying person who can meet you, not an unwashed physicist, you know, who's going to meet you.